Okay, so my presentation is over the death and burial in medieval Korea and the Buddhist legacy. Okay, so the author is Sam Vermeersch. He was born in 1968 in Belgium. His career, he got a PhD from the School of Oriental and African Studies from the University of London. In 2008, he joined the faculty of Seoul National University, and he became an associate director at the Center for Korean Studies. Another notable work of his that I put at the bottom is The Politics of Buddhism During the Goryeo Dynasty, which, if you're interested about politics, is very interesting. So to start us off, the main idea that I want to look at from this article is ritual versus ideology. The main 2 points of orthopraxy versus orthodoxy, which is essentially the how rather than the why they do what they do. The key focus that he tends to make is on the funeral process, especially on cremation versus burial. And how Buddhist beliefs and practices about death play into what's considered the traditional burial in medieval Korea, or in this case, Goryeo. Traditional burial is usually broken into sort of double burial. However, it has some inconsistencies with the evidence that's been given, and it's not 100% proven that that's how they normally did it. There's not enough evidence. Some main terminology that I want everyone to keep in mind is egalitarian, which, if you don't know, is the ideal that all people are equal, as well as soteriological, which is a doctrine of salvation, which when talking about Buddhism is very important, especially for death rituals and burial. For anyone that has only taken this Buddhist class and doesn't know much else about Korean history, Trubon is essentially the class system in medieval Korea, and your Trubon rank was essentially how related to the imperial family are you. You could take it in a literal sense of like actual bones, and it was essentially just a rank caste system. And another good point that I want everyone to keep in mind is epitaphs, as it's the main source of evidence given by Vermeersch. Especially in this sense, it's an inscription on a tombstone, which is where most of the evidence comes from, is the inscriptions themselves. The framework for this argument and article, there are 3 things that I want to keep in mind. And one of the main ones is that cremation was not a requirement in Buddhism, which is a constant theme that pops up a lot, because cremation is the main focus of this article, and there's no way to fully connect the fact that Buddhists that were cremated did it because they were Buddhist, not just for other belief systems. Another good point is that in the Goryeo period, the funerary ritual is more important than just the burial, especially for Buddhism. The lead up to the actual burial is held in high esteem rather than the actual burial of the body, which plays into the death process, which is essentially put into 3 parts. The process is used to overcome the sense of loss by the family and those that are close to the deceased. They prepare for the separation by focusing on purifying the body for the next life, which is then transitioned into a 49-day period, wherein the departed waits to be reincarnated. This process ends when reincarnation has been ultimately achieved. The main source of material given is funerary inscriptions and archaeological reports. Again, most of them just being inscriptions off of epitaphs and some very limited biographical information. He uses archaeological analysis and cross-cultural analysis a lot to make his argument. He uses some archaeological evidence kind of hypocritically on going back and forth on what it ultimately means. And cross-cultural analysis is used, especially in the case of the political and cultural trade going on at the time between Koryo and the Chinese dynasties, the Song and the Tang at the time. First, we look at the practice of cremation until circa 1050. Initially, the evidence found for Buddhist influence on the burial process was quite compelling. They found Buddhist motifs on Kokoryo burial tombs, relic worship, cinerary urns. There was a biography by monk Chajang, who was one of the most prominent monks in the Goryeo period, pushing for Buddhism to grow to a state religion. And then as well as King Mumu, who was the first imperial king to be cremated. However, little knowledge of the context in which those cinerary urns were found is had, so it's very hard to make assumptions on their exact purpose, as the context is a little ambiguous, so you cannot make full conclusions on it. There's also the fact that scholars make little distinction between relic vessels and cremated remains, which makes the lack of context even worse, because relic vessels are generally related to the Buddhas themselves, and then cremated remains can either be of the imperial family, monks, or of just commoner people in general. Another point is that King Mumu also had a normal full body burial tomb. He essentially had the cremation in the idea that he wanted to be scattered in the Eastern Sea so that he could become a water dragon and protect the country. It wasn't so much based in Buddhist practice. And generally, most kings will have their bodies buried next to temples if they were devout Buddhists, rather than having their bodies cremated and then buried. And also, after Monk Chajang, there's little to no evidence of cremation for monks until around the 11th century. So this evidence of especially the monks and of the imperial family is a good indicator to also look at the ordinary common believer to see if it was also paralleled in their lives, in their burials. It is also good to keep in mind that traditional burial, again, is very loosely interpreted. Most kind of interpretations of it is generally of a two-stage burial, and that it was still preferred by the monks. However, archaeological evidence to back the reconstruction of such practices is extremely hard to find in general. And again, most monks and kings rarely had their bodies cremated at this point in time. There was also the issue with the variations in the burial vessels. There was no standardized pattern for cinerary urns or just normal urns in general. So it's hard to make any conclusions on the exact use in the practice of Buddhism for their burials in general. Now it's important to talk about the practice of cremation after around 1050 AD. A big turning point around this time is the death of Monk Hidden, who was also a very prominent monk at the time, also pushing for the nationalization of Buddhism as a whole. Um, After his subsequent death, he had his body cremated, and then after that fact, it is seen that all monks were cremated, and it's hard to assess why, as it doesn't really give an explanation for his cremation on his epitaph other than the fact that he was cremated, which makes the kind of critical thinking on why this happened a lot more difficult, because there was no clear execution, no um, biographical information other than what was written, and most of the time it never really said anything other than devout Buddhist or practiced Buddhism, that kind of thing. Another good point is the Chinese and Confucian influence on Korean Buddhism. Again, going back to that cross-cultural analysis of the Song and Tang dynasties and Goryeo trading cultural and political ideas, which in turn caused the entwinement of Buddhism and the imperial court. It is very good to keep in mind, because in the later Goryeo, as it gets later closer to Choson, this is when Buddhism starts to get closer to being a national religion practiced by not just the imperial court and the elites, but most of the common people. Around this time, cremation started popping up a little bit more regularly. But again, it's good to keep in mind that cremation, again, was not a requirement of burial for Buddhism. Which leads us into cremation with the Buddhist beliefs. It's not quite sure why, but it is known that temples played a part in the holding of the deceased and subsequent burial process, but not much can be ascertained after the fact. Because in East Asia, the praying to Amitabha for merit for the deceased person was very big. It can be assumed that the families would take the bodies to the temples to purify them of death, so that it would be easier for them to be reincarnated into something better. And so as to not leave any bad karma in the house from the dead body. However, it's very hard to tie in cremation to the Amitabha belief system in the death rituals of the Goryeo period. The fact of belief without requirement is a very, very compelling point. It's more so that Buddhism didn't require cremation, and then cremation didn't require Buddhism. They were two completely separate identities that sometimes came hand in hand, but didn't rely on the other to occur. Some critical thoughts and takeaway that is burial is more resistant to change, which is why I believe he focused on the burial practices to look into the penetration of Buddhism into the Goryeo society. It's very hard to change people's perspectives and rituals into burying their dead, which means you can look over a period of time at these rituals and try and make some conclusions. However, there is little to no archaeological evidence to back this up. So it's very hard to make any assumptions, even with the unchanging period of time. But then also because it's over a longer period of time, as you go along, there are paradoxes in the research where the evidence doesn't quite add up to his claims, or his claims don't match what evidence he's giving, which overall really weakens his argument about Buddhism's part in the rise of cremation in the Goryeo period, in my opinion. The research isn't substantially documented, and it's very preliminary, and it needs more looking into. The data and the conclusions are kind of narrow based on the information given. It's also good to keep in mind that it's open to contesting interpretations and uses. It doesn't really tell much on the belief system of medieval Korea, but it does give a little bit of insight into the pattern of Korean burials themselves. So it's very interesting to look at cremation in relation to Buddhism, but because of the lack of evidence, it's very hard to make any concrete assumptions of the relationship between the two concepts, which makes his argument a little weak in my eyes about why he focused on cremation in general. But here is the article if anyone wanted to look at it as well. Okay.